July 11, 1975, 2:30 p.m. National Archives and Records Administration, College Park, Maryland. The scent of aging paper and dust hung heavy in the climate-controlled air. Dr. Alistair Finch, a junior historian with a fresh Ph.D. from Georgetown, carefully untied the faded red ribbon on a recently declassified file box. His gloved fingers lifted the cover of a thick report stamped with a faded top secret, marking OSRD Report Number 660-2, the Proximity Few, a report on the work of Section T. As he read the first few pages, detailing a miniature Doppler radar system built into an artillery shell, a cold wave of disbelief washed over him. He wasn't just reading a technical report, he was uncovering a ghost, a secret weapon so decisive its very existence had been a lie for over 30 years. The story of this ghost began on a humid Washington, D.C. afternoon, August 17, 1940. Inside the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism at the Carnegie Institution, Dr. Vannevar Bush, a stern man with a D.Eng. From both MIT and Harvard, officially authorized OSRD Contract OEMSR 271. He handed the file to Dr. Merle Anthony Tuve, a brilliant, restless physicist whose tweed jacket always smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and ozone. Tuve, who earned his Ph.D. from Johns Hopkins in 1926, had a reputation for being uncompromising. He was now the head of the newly formed Section T, tasked with a seemingly impossible challenge: create a weapon that could think for itself, a magic fuzz that could find its target in the sky with no human guidance, and do it before the Axis powers overwhelmed the free world. Bush gave him an initial budget of $1 million and a timeline of less than 24 months. The strategic imperative was suffocating. Across the Atlantic, the Luftwaffe was systematically dismantling London, and reports from naval observers detailed the terrifying ineffectiveness of anti-aircraft fire against modern bombers. Rear Admiral William H.P. Spike Blandy, a gruff 1913 U.S. Naval Academy graduate and the current chief of the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance, knew his fleets were sitting ducks. He pounded his fist on a table during a meeting with Dr. Bush, demanding a solution. The current kill probability for a 5-inch shell was a pathetic 1 aircraft for every 2,000 rounds fired. Blandy needed a miracle, and he was willing to bet on Tuve's wild idea. To protect this gamble, he assigned his top aide, Commander Ralph A. Ofstie, a man whose background in naval aviation intelligence made him pathologically obsessed with security. Ofstie's mission was simple: build a wall of secrecy around Project A, so high and so thick that not even a whisper could escape. So the birthplace of this miracle wasn't a gleaming government laboratory, but a grimy, nondescript former used-car garage at 8621 Georgia Avenue in Silver Spring, Maryland. This was the Applied Physics Laboratory, APL, a front created specifically for Project A. Inside, behind blacked-out windows, Dr. Merle Tuve assembled a team of over 700 of the nation's brightest civilian scientists and engineers. They worked in 18-hour shifts, fueled by stale coffee and the constant low hum of high-voltage transformers. Tuve, a man who preferred the workbench to the boardroom, could often be found with his sleeves rolled up, personally soldering a delicate triode vacuum tube, his face illuminated by the blue glow of an oscilloscope as he tried to solve the puzzle of making fragile electronics survive the 20,000 gigaseconds of force from a cannon blast. The air was thick with the metallic tang of solder and the palpable tension of a race against time. The device they were building was a ghost in a shell, a self-contained Doppler radar no bigger than a milk bottle, designed to nestle into the nose of an artillery round. It had to be a complete system: transmitter, receiver, amplifier, and detonator, all powered by a battery that only activated upon the violent shock of being fired. It was a technological leap so profound, so utterly beyond what the enemy believed possible, that it would change everything. Before I tell you how Dr. Tuve and his team of civilian scientists managed to build this impossible ghost in the machine, comment here where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss the story of how a secret born in a used car garage became the magic fire that broke the back of the German army. The year is 1940. Across the English Channel, the Blitz is tearing London apart. Night after night, the sirens wail, a sound that has become the city's heartbeat, punctuated by the crump of high-explosive bombs from Heinkel He 111s. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring has promised to break the British will from the air, and Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding's Royal Air Force is stretched to its limit. On the ground, the 3.7-inch QF anti-aircraft guns bark uselessly into the smoke-filled sky, firing over 400-500 rounds for every single confirmed kill. The air reeks of cordite and burning buildings, a testament to a terrifying new reality. Conventional air defense was a failure. In the cold, gray expanse of the North Atlantic, a different kind of war was being lost. Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, a cunning strategist, had unleashed his U-boat wolf packs, which were sinking Allied shipping at a catastrophic rate of over 500,000 tons per month by early 1941. On the bridge of a Flower-class corvette, the air was perpetually damp and smelled of diesel fuel and stale sweat. The only defense was the primitive ping of an Aztec sonar set, a fragile hope against an invisible enemy. With the Lend-Lease Act signed on March 11, 1941, the pressure on President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill was immense. The lifeline of supplies to Britain was being severed by U-boats and the long-range Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor bombers that preyed on convoys beyond the range of friendly fighters. This grim reality wasn't lost on Rear Admiral William H.P. Spike Blandy, the U.S. Navy's Chief of the Bureau of Ordnance. A gruff, stocky man who seemed to have been carved from granite, Blandy would sit in his Washington office late into the night of October 1941, a half-chewed cigar clamped in his jaw, poring over after-action reports from British observers. He saw the numbers and they made his blood run cold. Even with the advanced Mark 37 gunfire control system, the Navy's 5-inch/38 caliber guns couldn't cope with aircraft hitting speeds of 300 miles per hour. The mechanical time fuzzes were a joke, a gamble based on a guess made 15 seconds before firing. He explained the grim calculus to his aide, Commander Ralph A. Ofstie, a tall, severe man whose intelligence background made him see spies in every shadow. The math, Blandy growled, was going to sink them before they even fired a shot in anger. Then came the morning of December 7, 1941. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor wasn't a report, it was a gut punch to the nation. The air over Ford Island filled with the terrifying roar of 183 Nakajima B-5N Kate and Aichi D-3A Val bombers. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel and General Walter Short, the respective Navy and Army commanders, were caught completely flat-footed. In less than 9 minutes, the U.S. Sarasona BB-39 was a shattered, burning wreck, taking 177 sailors with her. The fleet's vulnerability was no longer a theoretical problem on Admiral Blandy's desk. It was a smoking, oil-slicked catastrophe that had crippled American power in the Pacific. The weight of this disaster fell squarely on men like Dr. Vannevar Bush. Looking more like a stern New England banker in his perpetual three-piece suit than the nation's top scientist, Bush met with President Roosevelt in the Oval Office on December 9, 1941, just 2 days after the attack. The room was thick with the scent of the president's cigarette smoke and a palpable sense of crisis. Bush, a man with doctorates from both MIT and Harvard, laid out the grim truth. America couldn't just outproduce the Axis, it had to outthink them. He told Roosevelt that victory would be forged not only in the factories of Detroit, but in the laboratories of Cambridge and Pasadena. He already had projects in motion, like Dr. Merle Tuve's Section T, But now the leisurely pace of scientific research was over. The war was here, and the timeline for a miracle had just become yesterday. That miracle was supposed to be born in the Applied Physics Laboratory, which in reality was a grimy, repurposed garage smelling of stale coffee and hot electronics. Here, Dr. Merle Tuve, a wiry, hyperactive physicist who gestured emphatically with the pipe that was a permanent fixture in his mouth, led a team of brilliant young minds, including future space pioneer Dr. James Van Allen. Their primary task in early 1942 was a soul-crushing exercise in failure, trying to make a delicate Sylvania T11 glass vacuum tube survive, being dropped from just 10 feet onto a concrete floor. The repeated thud and tinkle of shattering glass was the soundtrack of their frustration. Tuve, a Johns Hopkins Ph.D. from 1926, knew they had to solve an impossible trinity of problems: miniaturize a radio transmitter and receiver, make it survive 20,000 gigaseconds, and power it with a battery that activated only upon firing. The war in the Pacific didn't wait. During the Battle of the Coral Sea between May 4 and May 8, 1942, the U.S. Navy paid a heavy price for its technological shortcomings. Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher watched in horror as waves of Japanese bombers, particularly the nimble Aichi D-3A, Val, swarmed his carriers. The sky around the U.S. Lexington, CV-2, was filled with the black puffs of thousands of 5-inch anti-aircraft shells, a seemingly impenetrable wall of flak. Yet the Japanese pilots flew right through it. The Lexington was hit by 2 torpedoes and 2 bombs, and was ultimately lost. The gunners were brave, the guns were good, but the Fuzes were blind. Back in the suffocating, non-air-conditioned halls of the Navy Department building in Washington, D.C., Admiral Blandy was fighting his own war against bureaucracy. By July 1942, Project A's budget had swelled to over $10 million, and he faced intense skepticism from powerful figures like Admiral Ernest King, the famously abrasive Chief of Naval Operations, who believed in battleships, not the peculiar notions of horn-rimmed college professors. To win them over, Blandy and Commander Ofstie prepared dozens of charts, using stark data from the Battle of Britain and the ongoing Battle of the Atlantic, to prove that without a radical new air defense weapon, the upcoming invasion of Guadalcanal, Operation Watchtower, would be a bloodbath. He argued, until he was hoarse, that the fuse was not a luxury, but a necessity for survival. Ironically, the project's greatest protection came from the enemy's own arrogance. German scientists, while world leaders in rocketry under Wernher von Braun and jet propulsion, considered the idea of ruggedized electronics for artillery utterly impossible. An Abwehr intelligence summary from May 1942, meticulously reviewed by Commander Ofstie, explicitly stated that creating vacuum tubes capable of surviving cannon-launched G-forces was a decade or more away from technical feasibility. This profound underestimation of American ingenuity created a blind spot that Ofstie, a man who trusted no one, exploited to its fullest, wrapping Project A in layers of disinformation and compartmentalization. Reading that German report, Ofstie felt a cold, rare sense of confidence. They weren't even looking for a ghost because they didn't believe ghosts could exist. This technological deficit had a brutal human cost. On October 26, 1942, during the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, a 19-year-old gunner's mate named David Miller was on a 5-inch gun mount aboard the USS Hornet CV-8. He felt the deck plates tremble as he frantically spun the elevation wheel, the air thick with the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder and the deafening roar of his own gun. He watched helplessly as Japanese Val dive bombers plunged through the flak, their engines screaming. He saw one score a direct hit on the flight deck, then another. Within hours, the order was given to abandon ship. For men like Miller, the strategic calculus was simple. Their shells were exploding in empty patches of sky while the enemy's bombs were hitting home. While the Navy's crisis was in the Pacific, The U.S. Army was watching the war in Europe and North Africa with growing concern. The titanic struggle on the Eastern Front, where General Friedrich Paulus's Sixth Army had been fighting street to street in Stalingrad since August 1942, demonstrated the terrifying effectiveness of massed infantry and artillery. Observers like General Leslie J. McNair, Chief of Army Ground Forces, studied the British experience at the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942 and realized American artillery would need a decisive edge against both ground troops and the ever-present threat of the Luftwaffe's Stuka dive bombers. The need was universal. The scientific hurdles were almost comical in their difficulty. It wasn't just the straight-line acceleration. It was the violent spin, up to 400 revolutions per second, that generated immense centrifugal force. Dr. Tuve's team at the APL, particularly a brilliant experimentalist named Dr. Richard B. Roberts, realized a normal battery was impossible. In a breakthrough moment during a marathon session on the night of February 15, 1942, they conceived the, quote, reserve battery. The electrolyte, a caustic fluid, was stored in a delicate glass ampule. Only the 20,000 G shock of firing would shatter the vial, instantly activating the battery and providing the 200 volts needed to power the Fuzes' tiny ruggedized vacuum tubes. This was the secret that made the ghost in the machine possible. The enemy was also evolving. By late 1942, Commander Ofsti's intelligence analysts were flagging a disturbing new trend in reports from the Pacific. Japanese pilots, when their planes were damaged, were deliberately crashing them into American ships. While the organized kamikaze corps was still nearly 2 years away, these sporadic, body-crashing attacks were a terrifying harbinger. For Admiral Blandy, this was a paradigm shift. It was no longer enough to shoot a plane down. You had to vaporize it, and you had to do it far enough away that the wreckage itself didn't become a deadly projectile. The kill zone had to be pushed out to over 500 yards, a distance at which existing fuzzes were utterly useless. The immense pressure began to wear on Dr. Merle Tuve. He was a pure scientist, a man who loved the pursuit of knowledge, now tasked with creating a weapon of mass destruction on an industrial scale. His colleagues at the APL remembered him as a whirlwind of nervous energy, a man who chain-smoked Pall Mall cigarettes down to the nub, his tweed jacket perpetually dusted with ash. He would pace the lab for hours, surviving on black coffee and sandwiches eaten over blueprints. In his private letters to his wife from this period, he confessed a deep sense of dread, writing on April 3, 1942, that the weight of all those boys in the fleet was on his shoulders. This profound sense of responsibility was the fuel that drove the project forward through countless 18-hour days. And so, as the world burned through 1942, the stage was set. The Allied powers were backed into a corner, their fleets vulnerable, their cities bombed, and their armies facing technologically proficient and battle-hardened enemies. The existing tools of war were proving inadequate. The margin between victory and defeat was razor-thin, dependent on courage, industrial might, and most critically, a technological surprise the enemy could not predict. In the Pacific, the U.S. Navy was bracing for a long, bloody war of attrition. In Washington, military planners knew that something had to change. They were waiting for a breakthrough, a secret weapon. They didn't know that its delicate, impossible heart was already starting to beat in a converted garage in Silver Spring, Maryland. The entire secret hinged on a deceptively simple question that Dr. Merle Tuve posed to his team on August 20, 1940. How do you make a glass radio tube, as fragile as a Christmas ornament, survive a force 20,000 times that of gravity? The initial work at the Applied Physics Laboratory, funded by OSRD contract OEM-SR 271, was a soul-crushing parade of failures. Dr. James Van Allen, a young physicist from Iowa with a Ph.D. from the University of Iowa, would spend entire 16-hour shifts dropping Sylvania T11 tubes from a 10-foot platform onto concrete, listening for the sickening tinkle of shattered glass. The air in the repurposed garage at 8621 Georgia Avenue was thick, with the smell of ozone from high-voltage tests, and the stale scent of Dr. Tuve's ever-present pipe tobacco, a constant reminder that Vannevar Bush's initial $1 million investment was, so far, just paying for broken glass. The secrecy was absolute, a fortress built by the paranoid genius of Commander Ralph A. Ofstie. He established a system of such intense compartmentalization that a scientist working on the battery in one room had no idea another team was developing the oscillator just 20 feet away. The project was codenamed Project A, and the fuze itself was given the deliberately misleading name Variable Time, or VT, to fool enemy intelligence into thinking it was just a sophisticated mechanical timer. More than 700 scientists and technicians passed through the APL's guarded doors, but only a handful, including Dr. Tuve and his deputy director, Dr. L.R. Hafstad, knew the full scope of their creation. The breakthrough came from a physicist named Dr. Richard B. Roberts on a cold night in February 1942. He realized that the G-forces weren't just a problem, they were the solution. He sketched out the design for a, quote, reserve battery, a concept of pure mechanical elegance. The electrolyte, a corrosive liquid, would be stored in a delicate glass ampule. It remained inert, a sleeping giant, until the moment of firing. The incredible 20,000 G-shock would shatter the vial, instantly flooding the battery plates and generating the required 200 volts. To combat the 400 revolutions per second spin, the team learned to pot the delicate vacuum tubes and circuits in a solid block of castor wax, creating a rugged electronic core that could survive the apocalypse of its own launch. The feel of the tiny, cool glass ampule held the entire secret to the weapon's power. With the power source solved, the team focused on the brain, a miniature Doppler radar. The fuzz housed 4 tiny vacuum tubes, including a Sylvania 6L6 that acted as a complete transmitter-receiver. It continuously broadcast a radio wave in a cone shape at a frequency between 180 and 220 MHz. As the shell approached a target, the reflected signal returned at a slightly different frequency, the Doppler effect. The circuit was brilliantly tuned to listen for a specific beat frequency, the difference between the outgoing and incoming waves, that corresponded to a lethal range of exactly 70 feet. Dr. Tuve, who couldn't resist getting his hands dirty, spent over 100 hours personally testing circuits to make them ignore false signals from rain clouds, a problem that nearly scuttled the entire project in mid-1942. The shift from a laboratory prototype to a mass-producible weapon was a new kind of hell. Dr. Tuve, a man who believed in scientific perfection, demanded impossibly high tolerances for over 80 different components sourced from suppliers across the country. Companies like Crosley Corporation and Sylvania Electric Products were suddenly tasked with producing millions of microscopic parts that had to be perfect. The initial rejection rate for the delicate Thyrotron trigger tubes from Sylvania was over 50%. The clatter of the new assembly lines, run mostly by women who had no idea they were building a radar, was the sound of a new industrial war being born, a war that would be won by tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The moment of truth arrived on August 12, 1942, at 14:10 hours, in the hazy, salt-laced air of the Chesapeake Bay. Aboard the light cruiser USCL 55, a group of observers, including a stone-faced Rear Admiral Blandy and a visibly nervous Dr. L.R. Hafstad from APL, watched as the ship's 5-inch/38 caliber guns, trained on 3 Kinner Envoy radio-controlled target drones, buzzing in the distance. The order was given. A deafening roar ripped across the water as the first VT fuzzed shell, designated the Mk-32, screamed into the sky. Seconds later, a brilliant flash and a puff of black smoke appeared precisely 60 feet from the first drone, which disintegrated into 1,000 pieces. 2 more shots. 2 more identical, perfect airbursts. 2 more destroyed drones. Blandy lowered his binoculars, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. The ghost was real. The successful test triggered a financial and industrial avalanche. Dr. Vannevar Bush went directly to President Franklin D. Roosevelt in September 1942, bypassing the entire military procurement bureaucracy. In a meeting thick with the scent of the president's cigarette smoke, Bush secured what amounted to a blank check. The project's final cost would exceed $1 billion, more than half the cost of the Manhattan Project. This staggering sum funded the creation of 5 new, top-secret factories, employing over 20,000 workers, primarily women who meticulously assembled components they couldn't identify, creating 2.5 kilograms of composition B-filled death without ever knowing its true purpose. They were the ghost's silent, unknowing mothers. While the Navy's Mk-32 was entering production, the Army demanded its own version. General Leslie J. McNair, the pragmatic chief of Army Ground Forces, saw the Fuzes' potential for ground combat. He personally championed the effort to adapt the technology for the Army's workhorse artillery, the 105 mm and 155 mm howitzers. This presented new challenges, as the lower muzzle velocities and different spin rates required a complete redesign of the Fuzes' internal arming mechanism. By late 1943, after extensive testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground, where the heavy thud of howitzers echoed day and night, the T-105 Fuzz was born, a weapon specifically designed to create an airburst that would rain shrapnel down into trenches and foxholes. With deployment imminent, Commander Ofstie's final act of deception was his most brilliant. He personally oversaw the creation of training materials for over 150,000 Allied gunners. The manuals were intentionally misleading, referring to the fuse as a special timer and never mentioning the word radar. Crucially, every single gunner was ordered that if captured, they were to tell the enemy that the shells were detonated by a radio signal sent from their ship or from a ground station. This masterful piece of disinformation sent German and Japanese scientists on a years-long wild goose chase, searching for powerful ground transmitters that simply didn't exist, a phantom hunt that protected the secret until the very end of the war. By November 1943, the first crates of special ammunition, VT Fused, were being carefully loaded onto ships bound for the Pacific Fleet. Each crate, smelling of fresh paint and cosmoline, was handled by a special ordnance team under Ofstie's direct authority. Dr. Merle Tuve, his monumental task of creation finished, largely withdrew from the project he had birthed. He was a pure scientist who had created the perfect weapon, a contradiction that weighed heavily on him. His colleagues at APL would often find him late at night, long after everyone else had gone home, sitting alone in the dark lab, just staring at the silent, hypnotic green line of an oscilloscope, the visual echo of the invisible ghost he had unleashed upon the world. On January 5, 1943, off the coast of Kolombangara in the Solomon Islands, the light cruiser U.S. Helena CL-50 engaged a wave of Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers. Lieutenant J.G. David S. Forrest, the ship's gunnery officer, gave the order to fire the new VT fuzzed shells. A Japanese pilot, Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka of the 582nd Kokutai, watched in disbelief as the lead plane in his formation, flown by his friend Ensign Saburo Naito, simply vanished in a ball of fire and black smoke nearly 100 feet from the nearest visible shell burst. There was no trail of tracers, no direct hit, just a sudden, inexplicable obliteration. The report from a shaken Lieutenant Tanaka reached the desk of Lieutenant Commander Yoji Ito at the Japanese Naval Technical Department in Yokosuka 2 weeks later, on January 19, 1943. Ito, a methodical engineer who had studied at the Tokyo Institute of Technology, dismissed the claim of a magical exploding shell His team analyzed fragments from downed American aircraft and found nothing unusual, certainly no sign of a complex new fuse. Their conclusion, filed under Report 7B44, was that Ensign Naito was the victim of either a 1 in a million lucky hit on his bomb load or a catastrophic structural failure. The core belief among Japanese and German scientists was the same. Making vacuum tubes survive a 20,000 G launch was a physical impossibility, a technological fantasy not worth pursuing. This blindness was actively encouraged by Commander Ralph A. Ofstey's brilliant disinformation campaign. In a cold, damp interrogation room at Stalag Luft 3 in March 1944, a captured American B-17 gunner, Staff Sergeant Mike Kovac from Pittsburgh, calmly repeated the story he had been drilled on for over 200 hours. He explained to his interrogator, a Luftwaffe intelligence officer named Hauptmann Ernst Vogel, that the new shells were guided by a, quote, proximity radio beam sent from a special transmitter on the ground. Vogel, who held a degree in electrical engineering, found the explanation plausible. The lie was so effective that by May 1944, the German High Command had tasked over 300 technicians and 2 mobile radio detection companies, under the command of Oberst Kurt von Lettow-Vorbeck, to scan the English coast for non-existent high-frequency transmitters, a phantom hunt that wasted thousands of man-hours and precious electronic equipment. The Fuzes' first great European test came during the V-1 flying bomb crisis over southern England in the summer of 1944. General Frederick Pyle, commander of the British Anti-Aircraft Command, was given 500,000 of the new VT fuzzed shells. On July 12, 1944, he ordered them into action. The results were staggering. The kill rate against the 400 mph V1s, which had been a dismal 24%, jumped to 79% in less than 4 weeks. For the citizens of London, the sound of the war changed. The menacing drone of the pulse jet engine would cut out, and instead of a terrifying silence followed by an explosion, they now heard a sharp, reassuring crack asterisk in the sky as another doodlebug was swatted down by invisible hands miles from the city. In a secure lab at Peenemünde, Major Klaus Richter, a meticulous Abwehr analyst with a perpetually furrowed brow and ink-stained fingers, was losing his mind. His team examined the wreckage of dozens of V-1s that had been shot down over the English Channel. The fragments of the American 90mm shells yielded no clues. No clockwork, no barometric device, nothing. On August 2, 1944, Richter, a man who prided himself on logic, submitted a 40-page report to his superior, General Walter Dornberger. He concluded the Allies must have perfected an advanced infrared or acoustic proximity detector, a theory that sent German scientists on yet another 6-month wild goose chase, trying to develop countermeasures for a threat that didn't exist. The air in his office was thick, with the smell of frustration and stale cigarette smoke. The war in the Pacific was becoming a nightmare of a different sort. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf on October 25, 1944, the first organized kamikaze attack struck the American fleet. But ships equipped with the new fuse, like the carrier U.S. Intrepid DUS, CV-11, threw up a defensive screen of such lethality that Japanese pilots were utterly demoralized. A radioman aboard the Japanese cruiser Nachi, Petty Officer Kenjiro Hashimoto, transcribed the frantic final transmissions of pilots from the 201st Kokutai. The shells explode before they reach the ship. They are everywhere. It's a wall of fire. They were witnessing a kill probability that had jumped from 1 plane per 2,000 rounds to nearly 1 per 100, a 20-fold increase in lethality they couldn't possibly comprehend. On November 25, 1944, Sub-Lieutenant Haruo Abe, a 20-year-old former literature student from Kyoto, gripped the controls of his Mitsubishi A6M0, its belly carrying a 250-kilogram bomb. His target was the U.S. Essex-8, CV-9. As he began his dive from 12,000 feet, the sky erupted. But this wasn't the familiar pattern of flak. The black puffs of smoke seemed to anticipate his movements. appearing directly in his path as if placed there by an unseen hand. He felt a violent jolt as the Zero, flown by his wingman just 40 meters to his right, was simply shredded by a concussion wave, its wing shearing off without a single visible tracer round connecting. The air was filled with the acrid smell of burnt cordite. Abe's last, terrified thought, before his own cockpit was ripped open by a storm of shrapnel, was that the Americans had somehow learned to command the heavens, a power beyond technology. He never knew he was killed by a milk bottle-sized radar, operating on a 180 megahertz frequency. Ironically, the weapon that could have saved countless American lives during the Normandy campaign remained locked away. Following the strict security protocols established by Commander Ofstie, General Dwight D. Eisenhower had issued a directive on June 10, 1944, absolutely forbidding the use of VT Fuzes for ground artillery in Europe. The fear that a dud shell would be recovered and reverse-engineered by German scientists was considered too great a risk. For over 6 agonizing months, as Allied infantry fought and died in hedgerows and muddy fields from Omaha Beach to the Hurtgen Forest, more than 500,000 of the miracle shells sat in guarded depots across England and France, their immense power held in reserve, a ghost waiting for its moment. That moment came on December 16, 1944. Under the cover of a thick, freezing fog that grounded the entirety of the Allied air forces, General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt launched the Ardennes offensive. Over 200,000 German troops and nearly 1,000 tanks of the 5th and 6th Panzer Armies surged through an 85-mile front, shattering the American lines. The 101st Airborne Division was cut off and surrounded at the vital crossroads of Bastogne. For the first week, the situation was catastrophic, a desperate fight against overwhelming odds in near-zero visibility. The Allied High Command was facing its greatest crisis since D-Day. The pleas from the front became undeniable. On Christmas Eve 1944, General George S. Patton, Jr., his Third Army racing to relieve Bastogne, received the authorization he had been demanding for weeks. The coded message was relayed down the chain of command. In a frigid, candlelit command post near Neuchâtel, Belgium, Colonel Joseph A. Hawley, commander of the 261st Field Artillery Battalion, read the telex with stunned silence. He turned to his executive officer, Major Bill Compton, a former lawyer from Chicago, his breath pluming in the icy air. "They're letting us use the special Fuzes," Hawley whispered, the reverence in his voice unmistakable. "Get the VT crates from the guarded dump, now." At 1300 hours on Christmas Day 1944, as the men of the German 2nd Panzer Division advanced through the snow-covered woods near the village of Foy, the world ended. The first barrage from 21 battalions of American 105 mm and 155 mm howitzers screamed overhead. For Corporal Hans Schmidt, a 19-year-old grenadier hunkered down in a shallow foxhole, the sound was a violation of physics. Instead of the familiar whistle-then-thump of an impact, a horrifying crack, like a bolt of lightning, erupted 70 feet directly above his position. A storm of white-hot shrapnel from the M1 shells 2.5 kilograms. Composition B filler rained straight down, turning the snow red and the air thick, with a metallic smell of blood. In less than 10 seconds, Schmidt's entire 30-man platoon was annihilated. He was one of only 4 survivors, and he never saw a single shell land. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. German infantry training was built on a simple principle. When you hear artillery, you hit the dirt. That instinct was now a death sentence. The VT Fuze turned the very cover soldiers relied on, foxholes, trenches, craters, into inescapable killing zones. Panic, a force more potent than any explosive, rippled through the German ranks. Frantic radio messages, intercepted by Y stations in England, spoke of Zauberfeuer, magic fire, and air-bursting shrapnel of impossible accuracy. The weapon wasn't just killing soldiers, it was killing their will to fight. The German High Command was utterly confounded. General Hasso von Manteuffel, the brilliant commander of the 5th Panzer Army, was a veteran of the brutal fighting on the Eastern Front. But the field reports he received from the Ardennes made no sense. His battle-hardened troops were breaking and fleeing from what they described as invisible machine guns in the sky. His intelligence officers, including the perpetually frustrated Major Klaus Richter, could offer no explanation, theorizing everything from new phosphorus munitions to static electric fuzzes triggered by the fog. The fuzz had created a fog of war so thick that the enemy's most experienced commanders were left strategically blind. The tactical effect of magic fire was nothing short of miraculous, turning the tide of the battle. A single American artillery battalion, firing a 15-minute VT fuse barrage, could saturate an area 400 yards long by 100 yards wide, effectively neutralizing an entire German infantry assault before it could even begin. In a post-war interrogation conducted on May 6, 1946, by British military historian Captain B.H. Liddell Hart, General von Manteuffel stated unequivocally that the new American artillery was a primary reason for the failure of the Ardennes offensive. He described its effect on troop morale as catastrophic, a weapon against which his men had no defense and no understanding. And so the secret was kept, until the final shots were fired, from the flak-filled skies over the U.S. Missouri to the last German foxhole in the heart of the Reich. The enemy fought and died against a ghost. They faced a weapon whose intelligence resided within a 5-pound shell, a masterpiece of science and deception that hid in plain sight. The Axis powers weren't just outfought and outproduced. They were outthought, defeated by a technological leap so profound that its true nature was perfectly concealed by their own fatal, unshakable belief that it simply couldn't exist. The dam of secrecy finally broke, not with a leak, but with a roar of cannons in a snow-choked forest. General George S. Patton, Jr., his pearl-handled pistols, a glint of defiance in the Ardennes gloom, had his miracle. On December 25, 1944, General Dwight D. Eisenhower's strict prohibition was lifted. In the first 48 hours of use, the T-105 fuse, with its devastating 50-yard airburst radius, was credited by the 261st Field Artillery Battalion alone, with inflicting over 1,500 German casualties. The crisp, cold air, once smelling of pine and fear, was now thick with the acrid stench of cordite and death. While the Army's magic fire was turning the tide in the Bulge, the U.S. Navy was facing its own apocalypse in the Pacific. Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa, began on April 1, 1945, and it brought with it the full fury of the kamikaze. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, a weathered sea dog whose face was a roadmap of Pacific campaigns, watched from the bridge of the USS Bunker Hill as the sky filled with over 355 enemy planes on a single day. The fleet's only shield was the VT Fuzz, now in its improved Mk-53 model, its advanced circuitry designed to filter out the electronic noise of a massive fleet action. The continuous deafening thunder of 5-inch guns became the sound of survival. On April 16, 1945, the destroyer USS Laffey endured an astonishing 6 kamikaze hits and 4 bomb strikes, staying afloat only because its gunners, firing over 4,000 rounds, had created a protective bubble of flak that vaporized at least 9 other attackers before they could land a fatal blow. The demand for this miracle became an insatiable roar that echoed all the way back to the United States. By March 1945, the vast industrial network, quietly assembled by Dr. Vannevar Bush and overseen by Dr. L.R. Hafstad, was churning out an incredible 40,000 fuzzes per day from over 80 different factories, including the massive Crosley Corporation plant in Cincinnati. The project's cost had soared past the $1 billion mark. Even as production peaked, the scientists at APL were already evolving the Ghost, developing the Mk-58 Fuzz, with even more ruggedized pentode vacuum tubes, specifically designed to achieve a faster lock-on against the anticipated threat of German Me-262 jet fighters. The air in these plants, staffed mostly by women who were never told the purpose of the 130 intricate parts they assembled, was heavy with the metallic tang of soldering flux and the palpable tension of a nation whose victory depended on their unseen, meticulous work. Back in Europe, as General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group prepared to cross the Rhine in March 1945, the Foch became a brutal offensive weapon. The psychological terror of Zauberfeuer was now a documented military phenomenon. Wehrmacht prisoners captured near the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen on March 7, 1945, by the 9th Armored Division, were often found in a state of profound shock. They babbled to interrogators like Captain Saul Padover not of battles but of a terrifying, omnipresent death from above that made their foxholes, their only refuge, into inescapable graves. The enemy's search for an explanation grew more frantic and more misguided as the Reich crumbled. At the heavily guarded German experimental station at Recklinck-Lars, a team of top engineers led by Dr. Ernst Steinhoff, a brilliant rocketry expert who had worked alongside Werner von Blahn at Peenemünde, was desperately analyzing shell fragments recovered from the Ardennes. The jagged, useless pieces of steel, cool and inert to the touch, offered no clues. Their final, desperate intelligence report, filed on February 15, 1945 by Oberst Max Wachtel, concluded that the Allies must have deployed a network of powerful ground-based radio transmitters designed to prematurely detonate their munitions. This conclusion, a perfect echo of the lie Commander Ralph A. Ofstie had so carefully crafted 2 years earlier, sent hundreds of German technicians on a phantom hunt for transmitters that didn't exist, wasting precious resources and ensuring the Fuze's secret was kept safe by the enemy's own flawed logic. The Fuze's evolution wasn't just in its hardware, it was in the deadly art of its application. U.S. Navy gunnery officers, like the aggressive and brilliant Lieutenant Commander Arleigh Burke of Destroyer Squadron 23, the Little Beavers, developed entirely new anti-aircraft doctrines. They stopped targeting individual planes. Instead, using the astonishingly accurate Mark 37 gunfire control system, they began firing box barrages, creating pre-calculated, three-dimensional zones of death in the sky. A single Fletcher-class destroyer, firing just 12 VT Fuzz shells in under 10 seconds, could fill a cubic kilometer of airspace with a storm of lethal, high-velocity shrapnel. It was this tactic, refined to a deadly science, that allowed pilots like Commander David McCampbell to achieve their incredible kill ratios during the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot on June 19, 1944. The sheer scale of the secret's impact was staggering. By VE Day on May 8, 1945, American industry had produced over 22 million VT Fuzzes. The once skeptical Admiral Ernest King, now the powerful Chief of Naval Operations, admitted in a top-secret memo to Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal that the fuse had more than doubled the effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire and was directly responsible for saving an estimated 40 to 50 major naval vessels and the lives of at least 15,000 sailors from kamikaze attacks in the Pacific theater alone. The ghost in the shell had become the guardian of the fleet. Even in the war's final chaotic months, the security protocols remained suffocatingly tight. Commander Ralph A. Ofstie, now promoted to captain, enforced his rules with an almost religious zeal. On July 26, 1945, when the heavy cruiser U.S. Indianapolis, CA-35, delivered the core components of the Little Boy atomic bomb to Tinian, its ammunition lockers also contained a special shipment of the newest Mk-60 Fuzzes. The Marine Guards and ordnance crews handling the heavy, cool steel shells followed handling instructions stricter than those for the nuclear material, completely unaware they were juggling two of the three greatest secrets of the war. When the * Indianapolis was tragically sunk just 4 days later, on July 30th, hundreds of these state-of-the-art Fuzzes went to the bottom of the Philippine Sea, a loss of technology that Captain Ofstie, in a later report, lamented with an intensity that seemed almost to overshadow the horrific loss of life. The Ghost's final and most terrifying evolution was being planned for a battle that was never fought. As Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur finalized the plans for Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands, the VT Fuze was no longer a defensive tool. It was the centerpiece of their offensive strategy. The initial amphibious assault, scheduled for November 1, 1945, called for a preliminary bombardment using over 3 million VT-fused artillery and naval shells. The objective was to use the magic fire to systematically annihilate Japanese infantry in their trenches and coastal fortifications, a brutal calculus designed to save an estimated 250,000 American lives in the first month. The fuse had become the key to unlocking a victory that was projected to be the bloodiest in human history. But as Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, the secret held. The Ghost remained a ghost. In a dusty prisoner-of-war camp near Garmisch, Germany that September, General Hasso von Manteuffel, the architect of the 5th Panzer Army's brilliant Ardennes assault, was being debriefed by a young U.S. Army historian named Lieutenant Forrest Pogue. The German general spoke at length, with a mix of frustration and professional respect, about the, quote, new American artillery that had shattered his veteran troops' morale. He still had no idea what it was. The secret, born in a grimy garage and guarded by a fanatical naval officer, had survived the inferno of global war. Its true nature, a complete and devastating mystery to the men it had so utterly defeated. For 30 years the Ghost slept. Then, on July 11, 1975, it began to stir. The silence of the National Archives reading room in College Park, Maryland, was broken only by the soft rustle of paper. Dr. Alistair Finch, a junior historian from Georgetown, whose tweed jacket seemed permanently rumpled, carefully lifted the cover from a file box that smelled of time itself. His gloved fingers trembled slightly as he read the title on a thick, bound report, stamped with a faded red, Top Secret, OSRD, Report Number 660-2, The Proximity Phase, a report on the work of Section T. The document's very existence was a bureaucratic miracle. For decades, the records of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, over 35,000 cubic feet of them, had been a largely impenetrable fortress of classification under the National Security Act of 1947. It was only due to the slow, grinding pressure of the 1967 Freedom of Information Act and the quiet, persistent work of archivists like Dr. Edwin C. Fischel that these files were being reevaluated at all. This particular box, one of over 2,000 from the OSRD, had been declassified just 3 weeks prior, on June 20, 1975, its contents deemed historically significant but no longer a threat. It had sat on a shelf, an unexploded bombshell of historical truth, waiting for someone like Finch to finally pull the pin. As Dr. Finch turned the brittle pages, his academic curiosity curdled into profound shock. This wasn't just a report on a new type of artillery fuse. It was the complete biography of the Ghost. He stared at intricate schematics of miniaturized Doppler radar circuits, detailed reports on the ruggedized Sylvania 6L6 vacuum tubes, and metallurgical analyses of the glass ampule designed to shatter at precisely 20,000 gigaseconds. He read the after-action report from the USS Cleveland's live-fire test on August 12, 1942, where 3 perfect shots changed the world. He saw production summaries detailing the astonishing output of 22 million units from over 80 factories. It wasn't a fuse. It was an autonomous, self-guided weapon, a piece of 1960s science fiction that had been a 1940s reality, and its existence had been a complete and total secret. The weight of the discovery was crushing. Dr. Finch, a man who had dedicated his life to the neat narratives of history, suddenly understood that a central character had been missing from the entire second half of the war. The inexplicable collapse of the German advance in the Ardennes, the sudden, miraculous defense against the V-1 buzz bombs, the impossible survival of the fleet against the kamikaze, it all clicked into place. He wasn't just a historian reading a file. He was the first person in a generation to see the full, terrifying, and brilliant picture. The air in the quiet archive felt electric, thick with the presence of a secret finally waking up. The first ripple of this revelation came in April 1976, at the annual conference of the Society for Military History in Washington, D.C. Dr. Finch, his hands shaking so much he could barely operate the slide projector, presented his findings to a room filled with the titans of his field, including the formidable Dr. Russell Weigley. He showed them the declassified diagrams, the production numbers from Crosley Corporation, and direct quotes from a captured memo written by General George S. Patton, Jr. on January 2, 1945, calling the new Fuzes the most important innovation in artillery since the rifled cannon. The initial skepticism in the room, a palpable force that smelled of old books and pipe smoke, slowly dissolved into a stunned, reverent silence. The ghost, after 30 years, had finally been introduced to the world. The academic shockwave eventually reached a quiet study in Munich in the summer of 1982. The renowned historian Stephen E. Ambrose, now armed with Dr. Finch's research, was interviewing Wilhelm Fischer, a frail 80-year-old man who had been an Oberleutnant in the 2nd Panzer Division. Ambrose described the VT Fuzz in detail. As he spoke, Fischer's face went white. The old man began to speak in a hushed, trembling voice about the Zauberfeuer near Foy on Christmas Day 1944. He described the horror of seeing his men, hunkered down in their foxholes, vaporized by shells that never hit the ground, a magic fire that rained death from an empty sky. For the first time in 38 years, the old soldier understood. The ghost that had haunted his nightmares wasn't supernatural. It was simply a technology so far beyond his comprehension that it might as well have been. The history books began to change. Academic texts that had for decades attributed the victory in the Battle of the Bulge solely to Patton's grit and the eventual clearing of the weather were now being rewritten. The official narrative, painstakingly constructed over 30 years, was dismantled and reassembled to include a new central pillar. The ghost finally had its name printed in the annals of history, the variable time proximity fuze. With the secret out, the men who had kept it were finally free to speak. Dr. James Van Allen, the young physicist who had once dropped vacuum tubes onto a concrete floor and later discovered the radiation belts that bear his name, gave a series of interviews in the mid-1980s. He spoke not with pride, but with a quiet, weary sense of duty. He described the immense burden of silence, of watching for 30 years as the story of the war was told without its most crucial scientific chapter. He recounted the almost fanatical drive of Dr. Merle Tuve, a man who felt the weight of every sailor in the Pacific on his shoulders, a weight Van Allen and over 700 others had silently shared. The full, authoritative story was finally cemented in 1988 with the publication of Dr. Alistair Finch's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Ghost in the Shell, Section T and the Fuse That Won the War. Drawing on thousands of newly accessible documents from N-Era Record Group 227, Finch meticulously connected the dots. He linked the production of 40,000 fuzzes a day in March 1945 directly to the 79% kill rate against V-1s and the dramatic reduction in naval losses at Okinawa. He proved what James Finney Baxter III had claimed in his official 1946 history, Scientists Against Time *, that the proximity fuse stood with radar and the atomic bomb as one of the 3 scientific pillars of victory. But perhaps the most profound revelation was the sheer genius of the deception. Declassified memos from Captain Ralph A. Ofstie, dated October 1943, laid bare the entire disinformation strategy. The radio beam cover story, the deliberately misleading manuals for over 150,000 gunners, the orders to lie upon capture. Historians finally understood that the enemy's ignorance wasn't an accident. It was a weapon, a carefully constructed fortress of lies built around the ghost in the shell, a fortress so strong that it not only held for the duration of the war, but for 30 years after the guns had fallen silent. The official recognition, when it finally came, felt like a whisper after decades of thunderous silence. On March 27, 1948, President Harry S. Truman awarded the Presidential Medal for Merit, the nation's highest civilian honor, to both Dr. Vannevar Bush and Dr. Merle Tuve for their monumental contributions. But the full story remained locked away. It wasn't until historians like Dr. Alistair Finch began piecing together the declassified puzzle in the late 1970s that the ghost's true stature became clear. The reevaluation was seismic. Battle analyses were rewritten, crediting the fuse with saving an estimated 50 major naval vessels and preventing at least 250,000 Allied casualties in the planned invasion of Japan. The Applied Physics Laboratory, born in a grimy garage, now stands as a sprawling 453-acre campus in Laurel, Maryland, a living monument to a secret that redefined the very concept of a battlefield. The technological echo of that secret still reverberates today. The core challenge of Project A, miniaturizing rugged electronics, became the foundation of the entire post-war microelectronics revolution. The direct lineage of the Mk53 fuse, with its ability to detect a target's velocity and range via a 220 MHz Doppler shift, can be traced to the guidance systems of every smart bomb and air defense missile that followed, from the AIM-9 Sidewinder to the MEM-104 Patriot systems used in the 1991 Gulf War. The 22 million Fuzes produced for over $1 billion didn't just win battles, they created the DNA for all modern precision warfare. The human legacy is one of silent, profound burden and quiet vindication. For the over 700 scientists of Section T, including men like Dr. James Van Allen, the 30 years of silence were a heavy weight, knowing they held a central key to the war's history that they couldn't share. Posthumous honors were quietly arranged in the 1990s for many of the key engineers, including Dr. Richard B. Roberts, the inventor of the reserve battery, whose family received a special citation from the Navy on May 15, 1995. The greatest honor, however, was the one that remained unspoken. The knowledge that their magic fire, designed for the 3 million shell preliminary bombardment of Operation Downfall, became a weapon that ultimately saved more lives than it took by making the bloodiest invasion in history unnecessary. The cool, heavy feel of those declassified invasion plans tells a story of a catastrophe that was thankfully never written. Today, the physical remnants of the project are scattered and subtle, ghosts in their own right. The original garage at 8621 Georgia Avenue is long gone, replaced by a modern commercial building, its world-changing history marked only by a small bronze plaque dedicated on August 12, 1992, the 50th anniversary of the USS Cleveland test. But the true memorial resides in the quiet, climate-controlled halls of the National Museum of the United States Navy in Washington, D.C. There, behind a thick pane of glass, sits a cutaway Mk53 Fuzz. Its intricate guts, the 4 tiny Sylvania vacuum tubes, the coiled antenna, the delicate glass ampule of electrolyte, are laid bare, a silent testament to the genius that once hid in plain sight. The air in the museum is still and reverent, a world away from the frantic ozone-scented lab where it was born. Years later, an elderly Dr. Alistair Finch often returned to that museum exhibit. He would stand before the fuse, watching a new generation of children press their faces against the glass, their eyes wide with a curiosity that couldn't possibly grasp the weapon's true story. He no longer saw just a piece of military hardware. He saw the ghost, finally at rest, a silent, brilliant mind in a steel shell, the embodiment of a secret so profound it was protected by the enemy's own disbelief, a victory won not just with fire, but with a whisper.